Welcome to Open Source Health, the podcast that doesn't just talk about fixing healthcare, we're actively doing it. I'm Tripp Johnson, CEO of the Advita Collective, and I'm here to take you on a behind-the-scenes journey as we build a technology-forward, stakeholder-centric healthcare company. Our mission? To bring transparency and innovation to an industry that desperately needs both. Join us as we dive into the intersections of policy, technology, and hands-on healthcare, offering a rare glimpse into the challenges and triumphs of creating a system that works for everyone, patients, providers, policymakers, payers, and technologists alike. We'll share our journey of building in the open, and we'll have candid conversations with our team and other like-minded change makers who are as passionate as we are about revolutionizing healthcare. This is Open Source Health, where we don't just diagnose the problems, we roll up our sleeves and work on the solutions.
All right. How's the week going?
It's been good. It feels you had a lull today just mentally, but other than that it's good. Really looking forward to tomorrow. We've got our big team member appreciation day that our head of HR really organized. We got a great food truck coming that has lots of Asian food for me, so very excited about that. And had a lot of good cooking this week, and so it's been good. How about you?
Yeah, about the same. Pretty busy week, but looking forward to the weekend. I got a big Jujitsu seminar that's coming in. So we've the gym that I'm a part of, and if anybody knows Jujitsu culture, they know how weird and fragmented it can get, political. So we've recently joined under a new affiliate, and going to meet the owner of the affiliate for the first time. He's going to come down to a seminar, so pretty stoked about that, actually.
Nice. Let's not go too deep into the jujitsu politics, but I am curious what the main kind of division is, because where I'm going with this is apparently there's some new drama in the Ashtanga world, and I like the parallels for us between our Ashtanga practice and jujitsu. Do you call it practice, training?
Yeah, whatever.
Are pretty similar. So what's the main drama?
Yeah, so the main drama, I think, would break down according to the Gracies, the original founders with Jiu-Jitsu, the people who sort of developed Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. A lot of them, I would argue, have become pretty proprietary. And so they've developed their own sort of curriculums that really emphasize self-defense versus sport jiu-jitsu versus what more people are calling like American jiu-jitsu now.
Mm.
So one of the pressures that I think that some of the Gracies have started to exert is you have to buy branded gis and branded material from them. You have to pay fees to them. You have to teach a special curriculum that they have like propriety and ownership in. And so, I mean, story old as time, right? Is where the breakdown's happening is finances and money, right? Probably some greed.
There's a similar thing that is happening, I think, in the Ashtanga world. I listened to a podcast yesterday, and it happened first when, like, the founder of the, Ashtanga method as we know it today, when he passed away, there was a split. Does the lineage go to his son or his grandson or his daughter? And then recently, so basically, most people said it went with the grandson, and he had a heart attack last year when he was in Charlottesville, Virginia, and died like totally unexpectedly at 50 years old.
Yeah.
And what's transpired, I guess, was people went back to India for the traditional like season that they would have, and other people kind of started teaching, and it was emerging somewhat naturally. But now there are these rifts, like,
Yeah.
does
Yeah.
it count if you got certified now? Does it count if you're getting new poses, and who's in charge? And I'm like, at the end of the day, and then this is a community I'm like really invested in, I guess,
Yeah.
or I have been a part of for a long time. But it's really kind of, I don't know. I mean, I'm just on the sidelines, kind of eating popcorn this time. Like, I don't have any emotional ties to it, and
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
just, the practice works for me, and that's about it.
Man, I at the temptation of sliding too far into our own silos and interest. This is it's so fascinating to me how structurally these things end up being so similar. And I think it's the same for like any sort of pursuits that involve humans, right? Is this because that's a similar sort of idea, right? Like there's people that predated the Gracies that would say they didn't actually invent anything; they just packaged it differently, right? And arguably, creativity's there's no such thing as original or creative because it's all just repackaging of pre-existing things, and then invariably egos or something get involved in something, and then incentive structures get misaligned or something, and then you end up with this like these rifts. But it's just fascinating hearing you say like, well, who owns this thing, this stretch or this movement? Well, what do you
Right.
mean?
Well, and that's like it would be very similar. So, like the big discrepancy right now, or the big controversy, is if you got new poses, if you got new postures when you went to India, like is it valid? It's kind of like, did
Yeah,
you get a new belt or something? And it's someone, whose judgment are you going for? And like the guy who was your teacher died, so now like you got to find a new teacher, or like you don't have a teacher, which like I don't know, do you even need a teacher? And all of it, to me, I mean, at least jujitsu isn't packaged as some spiritual
right, right.
program, whereas like the Ashtanga method has largely just become gymnastics. And it's like, just because my legs go behind my head doesn't mean I'm necessarily any closer to enlightenment. And there are dancers who've never done Ashtanga and can do more than I can do. And
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's a very bizarre system. But anyway, well, I guess that's a decent segue. Like, one of the things we wanted to talk about was community, and I think especially this idea of finding community these days, and where potentially men in general, people in general, are struggling to find community. But I think it's especially becoming a pervasive problem for young men.
Yeah, what kicked this off for me, I had a conversation last week with a professional that does a lot of placement and referrals. And he said something that was absolutely interesting to me. He said when he first started helping try to guide young men towards like mental health treatment or things like that and helping them navigate that, that he was a really big believer in therapy and the importance of therapy. Which is funny because I asked him a follow up question like, "Well, have you ever benefited from therapy?" He's like, "Well, not really." He's like, "Have you?" And I was like, "No." He's like, "Aren't you a therapist?" Like, "Yeah, that really helped me." And so he said he's actually become increasingly skeptical of the carte blanche benefit of therapy for young men and men in general. And I think that's a really, really captivating and interesting narrative because it runs so counter to this all-encompassing idea of therapy for all. Men get in therapy, men get involved in therapy, and so that for me, that's really where that kicked this conversation off for us.
What I think, like, even lingering just on the therapy specific point, because I'll introduce a new character, one of our new male therapists, Dan. Dan and his wife came over for dinner last night, and we also went for a walk today with Dean, who you know.
Yeah, yeah,
And Dan is very into men's issues in general,
yeah,
and the way we got connected originally was because he started an organization called Authentic Men, which is non-clinical,
yeah,
with someone else who we know. And uh, he had gone to school to be a therapist maybe 10 years ago, but had never really put his clinical degree to practice. Had
hmm
worked in the corporate world. But he started Authentic Men because he was part of a men's group, a
yeah,
coaching
yeah,
group. So he was part of this men's group. He met this other guy, Tom, who connected Dan to Advita Health. And the two of them really hit it off on like some small group work, and decided to start Authentic Men, which I can't really speak that much to it, but I thought it was really interesting. And we were talking about how we're actually like pretty excited to get some men's groups started.
yeah.
And so I'm interested in teasing this out because I might even play the pro therapy person for the sake of this conversation.
Right.
But I share some of the skepticism around, therapy for all. So I guess, I'll just play the pro therapy kind of space and
Do it.
let's tease it out and see what we got.
Yeah, do it. What would you say? Like, make your still man your argument for pro therapy for men.
Um,
Let's keep it contained to men specifically, but still man this argument.
so I think historically there are stereotypes that are pretty true. Men have been encouraged to probably push down emotion.
Right.
There is a stereotype of a breadwinner who went to work, a woman who stayed at home, and our society has changed greatly since then. Almost all of that's positive, but there are definitely some negative ramifications, at least right now, and in our moment in time for being a man. I think there's a lot of um, conflicting information, right? Like I grew up watching Rambo and Commando and Arnold Schwarzenegger, and I ended up being an Army Ranger. So like I bought into the alpha male kind of mindset, and and quite frankly, fast forward, it was a quarter life crisis that got me way off of that kick, and I became very interested in consciousness and meditation and yoga. Uh, and then kind of stumbled my way into behavioral health, thinking that this is like how we're going to apply this interest in consciousness and my own subjective experience to building an organization that does this and helps others. So
Yeah.
from a very practical level, just on the personal side, it's like, look, people are looking for some of this help in navigating life. The system that we look to, being the American medical system, uh, recognizes therapy as the way to get help. And
Right.
so, like, let's tap into this system. The alternative to me would have been, become a yoga teacher, lead retreats, do coaching type work, or start a coaching type organization.
Yeah.
And I mean, personally, I just wanted to work within the system because it's there for a reason. If it's not doing what we want it to do, being the system is not getting the outcomes that we want, I felt like it was better to build within the system and push for changing it the way that we wanted versus like trying to build outside the system. So maybe there's just at a baseline, there's a utilitarian argument that a system exists and we should use it.
Yeah. And you would argue that the system is therapy, like for men in this case. Like that is what you would be arguing.
I'm arguing that, everyone at different points in life, we all struggle, and that therapy is seen as the system, the recognized system intervention to help people that are struggling not with physical health, but are just not coping with life well. They're not functioning the way they want. They're not feeling the way they want. And that therapy and psychiatry or behavioral health more broadly is geared towards helping address some of those needs.
So I have two responses, two initial thoughts to that. If I'm going to play the self-hating therapist, all right?
I don't think it's an act.
No, yeah, hate myself just plenty. Thank you. The so one, the research and outcome on therapy is not great, right? It's confounded by a lot of stuff. There's this phenomenon in research that I think is really interesting. It's called this like return to mean, or like return to like baseline functioning, and it's essentially this idea that moods, flow states, all this sort of stuff are transient anyway. And so a lot of times when people say therapy is really effective, they haven't been able to control for the natural progression of someone just getting better. And so it makes it really difficult to say what variables make therapy effective, what types of therapy are effective. So I would say it's difficult to know what the empirical basis is for making therapy effective. The second thing I would argue is I'm not sure that therapy is totally without harm, right? I think one of the potentially most dangerous parts of therapy can be this a very reflexive human tendency to identify with labels, to identify with transient states, to identify with narratives. And I think both you and I, coming from a non dualistic background, would argue that that's probably the root of most suffering, is this identification with these transient states that arise into consciousness. So those would be my two sort of counterpoints to that. But I also want to be very clear. I'm not arguing that therapy doesn't have effect and benefit for some people. I'm just curious, especially for men, what type of therapy is effective? What does that actually look like? What are the effects?
Well, and I'm not someone who's done a lot of therapy. I tried to
Yeah.
establish a relationship with a therapist who kind of came at it from a more Eastern Buddhist inspired, maybe not necessarily non-dualistic approach, but understood all of that. Um, but so I'm not someone who's steeped in this, and I think sometimes it's where I, I mean, I just don't have the personal experience to say this was really helpful. But I think that, I'm just going to use therapy as it's there, it's a known quantity. It's where you go for this. I think the question I'm going to ask and try and answer is, why therapy versus something else? What was there before therapy? And I don't know, right? Because I
Yes.
do think that the men's issues and the stereotypes are real, and that
Yeah.
a lot of time men have struggled maybe more than women to be vulnerable and
Mhm.
to build this. I'm really into this idea that I was introduced to recently of mutual aid, and the idea that I'm not someone who naturally gravitates to mutual aid. I like being in control in general.
Yeah.
I don't mind people depending on me, but I don't want to depend on other people. And that's kind of one of the key distinctions with, mutual aid, is that you're not just being relied upon, but you're relying on others, in
Yeah.
your actual community. And so I think, like, as we've seen, we're both atheists here, and I think one of the, side effects of religion kind of losing its hold on society is that we don't have some of these institutions that we used to look to for spiritual guidance, for, whatever the big questions, the existential questions that we have. What's the meaning of life? What's my purpose? How do I flourish when the world's so chaotic? So I kind of just think, like, well, in theory, right now, therapy's the uh, the system's answer to that, and
The
and I think
methadone.
we have a lot of people really struggling, and so yeah,
Yeah.
like, I'm interested in therapy being useful, and I share the skepticism, but I'm hopeful that we at Advita Health are doing the things necessary to make sure that the work that we're doing is actually effective.
Yeah. So I want to share a little story just because I think it potentially highlights a point you made, and then I think we can tie it back in. So I grew, you and I've talked at length about this, but I grew up religious. You know, grew up in an alcoholic home, kind of chaotic father figure, all that sort of stuff. So I think I was always primed to seek out any sort of uh, community or something that felt safe or whatever. So I inherently sort of gravitated towards church because that was what was available to me in Eastern North Carolina. Um, Fell in love with the idea of church and the experience of it, and the community and all that sort of stuff. Went to college, thought I was going to be a minister, and then left college as an atheist, and ended up having this really sort of interesting moment with a professor. He was a pretty devout Baptist, but also a scholar. So I was having this crisis of faith sort of thing, and talked to him for a little bit. And he said something that's always stuck with me. He said, never abandon a belief until you have something better to replace it with. And this wasn't him encouraging me to sort of hold tight to my faith or anything. It was just quite literally an invitation to, like, listen, belief serves utility, community serves utility. If it ceases to serve that function, then you move on to something else. And so he said that, and it was one of those things that it's just become increasingly true over the last 20 years. And so I had this moment where I had moved to Asheville, was living in the area, and had been in martial arts earlier in my life, and wanted to get back involved in it. Had career had started, other friends' careers had started, and so just being around people took more effort. And so joined jujitsu, fell in love with it immediately. Like just loved it, the community, that all that sort of stuff. And then immediately, what I started noticing after about 2 or 3 months, that I was starting to engage in these ritualistic sort of behaviors that I was using as this means of like connecting to community of jujitsu. Um, all in this, I could elaborate on all of that sort of stuff, but there's this one moment that I had where I realized I was like, I bowed to an opponent, which is not super common for jujitsu, but just like did it right. And I realized that I had done it consciously as this way of sort of honoring the system or what this thing was delivering to me or honoring the community that I was a part of. And it dawned on me that effectively I was having the same affective, relational, emotional experiences that I'd had in the community of church. But now I was getting I would say, argue all the benefits of church without some of the wackiness, until we had the big gem split and it went culty. But
Yeah, and I think I mean totally same thing for me with the Ashtanga piece was I mean I went, off the deep end, when I was getting out of the army, I was still clinging to a lot of the Western pursuits. I was going to law school, but really my primary focus was just this kind of spiritual path, which to me was always like framed very much in the, Enlightenment project. But a lot of the positive benefits that you just receive as a human navigating life was, I moved to DC and I immediately had a group that had long-standing, you know, ties to each other, and I was welcomed into that group just like you would be in a church. And more so than church, like we got together, we practiced every morning before, work or school. So 6 a.m. there were 15 to 20 of us every morning just doing our thing in the same space together. And then on Sundays, a lot of times we'd go out for coffee and talk. And I mean, that's how I met my wife. And so,
uh,
very similar to what you would probably have expected 100 years ago in a church community. You're on the Oregon Trail heading west, and you find a new church, and you meet your wife, and so
yeah,
like I think a lot of this does go back to institutions, and that
hmm
what's so difficult right now. And I think like one of the things when you were talking that came up for me was this. You and I have each talked a lot about how in the jujitsu community, it brings people from all walks of life. It
yeah,
brings
yeah,
people from all over the spectrum, and you're there to do one thing, and it's practice, train jujitsu. But you don't disagree about politics in there. You don't talk about all these things, or they can
yeah, yeah,
come up, but they don't have to be like when we're behind our phones or computers and we're saying how stupid could this person be. You're like, yeah, I mean, I actually like the guy. I mean, he might be an idiot here, but who
yeah.
cares?
He's
And I
not
think
vaccinated, but
yeah, and so I think like I think that's like something that we're all sometimes missing. And I think it's actually potentially like a real promise of group therapy is I think like potentially really well facilitated group therapy allows you to appreciate the differences that we have, evolve our own opinions. So on one hand, I'm actually like more skeptical about like individual therapy than I am group therapy for the reason that we're all on our own islands in our own consciousness with our own thoughts that no one else has access to. The thought
yeah,
that the idea that we're gonna share our thoughts with one other person and they're gonna help us figure everything out seems a little hard for me to navigate because you're just putting them in a
yeah,
weird position of power over your experience or how you're interpreting your experience. Now, in a group, yeah, sure, that's true. Now it's just multiplied with more people. But I don't know. There is something to me valuable about group settings. But I also think like a lot of times like you and I are people who like to talk about not just deep, big universe ideas, but our personal experiences. I think
Right.
like I know for me, and I would imagine it's true for you, but we like I develop relationships pretty quickly, and people are like, I really feel like I know you. Maybe it's our ADHD, our wanting the
Yeah.
novelty, and so like we need novel ideas about people, and we want to
Yeah.
get to the deep stuff, the real stuff. Like, don't
Right.
take
Right.
me to a dinner party where I'm not supposed to talk about politics, money, and religion because I ain't got shit to talk about.
Right.
Like,
We're
I
both
only
pretty
want to
shitty at
talk about
small talk.
yeah, like the idea that we want to do small talk doesn't
Yeah.
entice me, which I think may also be one of the reasons that I'm naturally maybe a little more skeptical of therapy is because I
Yeah.
engage in the real world. I engage in life wanting to have these deeper conversations, not feeling like there needs to be a taboo against any of it. But I think for a lot of people that exists, and if they're not a member of a church community, school community for their kids, something like that, then they're on this island. And again, I would say we're all on the island, and the big goal is to understand that it's all connected, yada yada yada.
Right.
But realistically, most people aren't spending the time and the hours, and so they need an outlet for it. And
Yeah.
therapy is just one that exists now.
See, it's interesting though, because I therapy exists with is I would argue it's almost like an opiate replacer or something for actual relationship and intimacy and community or whatever, right? Like it's I am interested in this idea of and want to hear you talk more about like why is it that you like expound on group therapy, right? Like and do it specifically from the framework of men. That's because I'm kind of curious about that because
Well,
I have considered that and I think that's a really fascinating perspective.
Well, it's what I'm teasing out right now. It's not fully formed, but what I would say is I'm really interested in the idea of starting men's groups here.
Yeah,
And why is that? It's because I would genuinely be interested in being a participant in a men's group.
right,
And
right,
now that I've got two small kids, like that was not an easy transition for me. And I like to talk about these things. And I like to talk about the fact that it's hard. Uh So I mean I think that's why I'm interested in it. And then the corollary I would use is I was part of a leadership group for a long time, and it wasn't just men, but it was probably
yeah,
80% men, and it was all CEOs of companies, and we had a facilitator. That was his full-time job, was facilitating these groups. And he also met with us individually, much more of a coaching model than
right,
therapy per se. But the real benefit of it was over months and years of getting together, we understood a lot about each other, and we understood maybe some of the blind spots.
mhm,
And so we had a group that was kind of like, a board of advisors or a kitchen cabinet, you might say, and uh, they could listen to the issues and just bring up what they're experiencing from it and lend some of their own personal experience uh, to the other members of the group. And again, I think you find this is not entirely dissimilar to 12-step communities, is not entirely
yeah.
dissimilar to a lot.
I so this is you hit on a couple of themes that I wonder if there's something about it that potentially is uniquely masculine. You know, speaking in broad strokes, but you hit on sort of the idea of like sharing struggles and then sharing solutions, right? Like this sort of utilitarian bend to this
Hmm.
thing. And so, just because it's the frame of reference that I have, and it's the frame of reference we've already referenced, right, I think about my time in jujitsu. Some of my favorite moments in jujitsu are sitting down with a couple of teammates and us workshopping some idea or concept that we're struggling with, or some sort of technique. And it's like I had a night a couple like last month where I ended up on the mats for like 2.5 hours. It was like 9 o'clock, and we realized like, oh crap, we gotta run. But we just got this nice little flow state around that. And what was interesting is I was riding high for a couple of hours. Like I felt amazing, right? And like felt great the next day. and it wasn't necessarily any sort of like deep, what anything pertaining to emotions. It was just this deep sort of flow state connection around this activity or thing that we were in. And so I wonder if there's something, and then just sort of dawned on me, right? When you were talking about what you would appreciate in a men's group and what you appreciated in your leadership group was, these are the struggles I'm having and here are the solutions.
Mhm. Well, I think what part of what it is, you mentioned flow state. So I think that these are sometimes you need a forcing function,
Yeah,
and jujitsu is a forcing function, Ashtanga is a forcing function, going to church is a forcing function. I remember, so I met a guy on a plane. I was reading a Ramana Maharishi book, which is an obscure non-dual,
yeah,
teacher who's dead now. Uh, but the guy beside me on the plane's like, "Oh, yeah, I knew him," and I was like, "What?" Like, I'm flying to Austin, Texas, and you knew this guy, and then long story short, guy ended up, he was in prison for 10 years for like smuggling drugs, is now like a successful, business guy. Um, and then he invited me to go to some kind of new age church like thing, right?
yeah, yeah,
Not necessarily non-dual teaching, but just, very you what's a unitarian, very much like a unit. It wasn't a Unitarian church, but very similar. And I went twice with him and his wife. This is right when I had moved to Raleigh. And after going to that, like, I didn't want to go, but I said I'd go, and I
yeah,
went. And then I got out, and I was like, I feel good. Uh,
yeah,
and and it didn't make me keep going, but I probably didn't put in the work to really build I only went a couple times. But yeah, just that notion that like we need something to externally commit to, because
hmm,
our what's tougher these days is like that used to be the norm, is you had external community. Now we build up our entire worldview oftentimes from behind our cell phones,
yeah,
and
yeah,
all of our worldview then becomes very algorithmically curated just to reinforce and potentially bring out the worst in us.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so, like, because of that, I think there is this need for community, and I see a value in group therapy, or in having some structure to navigate life.
Yeah. Is this a there's a topic I want to switch to that I think is still sort of connected with this, but Scott Galloway has been talking about this a lot recently, and especially post election, around some of the hardships facing young men. And I think that's a really, in men in general, but and, I think that's a really, really fascinating idea, right? Like, I don't have some of the stats off the top of my head or any of that, but you may. So like they're lagging behind in education, they're higher in suicide, like deaths of desperation, or I forgot what the phrase is, but to me this ties into some of the work Derek Thompson, journalist and great podcast, who we're both, at least I'm man crushing on him and trying to onboard you as a man crush for him too. But I'm really, he's talked a lot about this loneliness epidemic, and I think him and Galloway are speaking a lot to this. I think Galloway tends to focus a little more on how it's impacting men, but what you just said with the screen and algorithm piece seems really, really
Mhm.
good between that stuff.
Well, some of the stuff that he's highlighted, I mean, specifically, and again, the focus is on young men, not because women don't struggle, not because there haven't been, long-term systemic inequities, but the things are changing, and they're changing negatively right now in a way that it affects men, and that
Yeah,
the second order effects are likely going to be affecting women and society.
yeah,
Some of the stuff he highlights, I don't have the stats in front of me or anything, but you know, higher ed, I don't know if it's been 15 or 20 years since, the majority of people in college became women. The, maybe the issue with that, at first blush is, well, maybe they're just the most qualified. Sure, true. The
yeah,
problem may be that, women who get a college education do not pick mating partners without a college education, which then ends up changing the dating pool even more so, in the sense that they're looking for even older and more accomplished men. And so
Hmm.
there is this, and we're being very heteronormative and everything, all the qualifiers. But these are just things that are happening in society, and we don't necessarily know that they're all bad, but it's problematic. So young men are more likely to have substance use challenges, have a behavioral addictions, whether that's gambling, pornography, substance use. And I think a lot of that's reinforced again with the algorithm. So if you are more of a risk taker, men are usually riskier. That's just like a biological fact, I believe. Don't come after me, police. But now you've got the ability to trade options on Robinhood from your phone. So now, instead of, you used to only be able to lose the money you had, well, now you can go into essentially infinite debt with and these apps are built for engagement. So they are, they're gamified, and unfortunately we do not have the ability to protect ourselves, in the free will notions that a lot of people have. Like, we are victims to our tech overlords in many ways. And I think that because of that, it's more important now than ever that we lean into real world interactions and building our own communities, because
Yeah.
otherwise we're stuck behind a screen and we're only left to our own devices.
Yeah. Then the algorithm stuff is super fascinating, right? Like, man, the gambling thing feels so dystopian to me in a way that's like horrifying, right? It's this pseudo connection or something. Like, there's this weird, but it's like preying on you in some sort of way, so that you're just kind of like obsessed with this thing that's going to take everything from you. I think the stats on something on like DraftKings or some of these like online sports betting stuff is only like 3% of the people ever take money out. So like 90, it's built off the whole model. It's built off of 90% of people, 97% of people losing their money that they're putting in. And so
Mm-hmm.
you see this disproportionately affecting men, and for probably a lot of reasons. Maybe just per capita we're dumber and more primates or something, right? Knuckle draggers in some sort of way, but. Um, where this becomes really interesting, right? Like, I'm generally comfortable, and it makes sense to me to say that the prescription for this would be get involved in community, be involved in some sort of activity. Like, I think about, be of use to someone else, right? This mutual dependency or mutual connection that even people like you and I may pray like not necessarily like, but there is benefit to being dependent on someone, and allowing others to be dependent on you. And so the difficulty in that, right? Like, I think this newfound barrier, pure in a good, right? Like, I don't know how to point to this necessarily, is you can have a lot of pseudo connection, and you can be trapped in this hedonic cocoon, right? This is the day one of March Madness. And all I want to do is go sit on the couch by myself, watch the games and text friends and scroll social media and see what's happening and partake in this communal event, but do it virtually, right? And so if I'm going to participate in any sort of activity where there would be actual human interaction, which arguably, like, I feel confident saying that that's an important feature of being a healthy human being. I can't point to anything empirically, but I think intuitively we could agree with that. But the difficulty of now engaging from that is I'm trapped in this hedonic cocoon of social media, the thing that's in front of me. I could switch between 15 different streaming services while I'm watching it. I could be binging any number of TV shows, have it on in the background, any of that, right? Like, I could do all of that and just be trapped in this little cocoon, all the while texting and feeling connected to people. Or I could go to a bar, sit down and grab a beer and watch the game and talk shit with a neighbor or something, right? That's really tough to move yourself out of that into something that's a little more communal and physical. It's like, if we are confident that's prescription, then how do you get engagement in that, right? How do you get some shift?
Well, I think that maybe that's the goal. One of the therapeutic goals that a lot of men or anyone engaging in therapy should be getting over whatever internal hurdles there are, that becomes the default. The default for humans should be to go out in the world, to interact with each other.
Mhm.
Um, but I mean, really, our whole society, I don't want to turn it into some capitalism rant, but right, like capitalism very much
Yeah.
encourages us to be individualistic, to look out for ourselves, to maximize our returns, not to think about like the communal well-being. And we don't have to depend on each other the way we used to. And so, like, think about the aftermath of Hurricane Helene when, you
Yeah.
were doing a ton of work. I helped out a couple of days getting supplies up to Asheville. And all of a sudden, like, community was visceral in a way that for me hadn't existed since I was in the Army. That there were
Mhm.
people in great need and I could help alleviate their suffering with very simple acts. And I think in past decades or centuries, that was the norm, and
Yeah.
we've become what feels like self-reliant, but to your point, maybe it's just kind of in our hedonic cocoons.
Yeah.
And so I just have to think that part of any good therapeutic goals needs to be the establishment of community, real community, not a
Mhm.
therapeutic relationship.
Yeah.
Um, because there's so much good that can happen from that. You don't necessarily have to be in this therapeutic alliance in order to benefit from human interaction. But
Right.
you may need the therapy to be able to go out there into the world, or I don't know. I mean, that's kind of
So
where I fall.
I like that, right? In some sense, right? The therapist, and maybe we'll keep this focused, maybe just on men or something, right? Like, but I don't know that it just pertains to men. But this idea of perhaps the object of therapy when you're working with a man is how do you get them connected to some sort of community, right? And that becomes the thing: is what is the therapist's role in helping the person construct this idea of community and get involved in it in some sort of capacity?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I think like from the substance use side, so much, and I know we're not running like
Mm.
obviously we're not doing 12-step facilitation, but I do think one thing that can be very impactful for anyone struggling with substance use is getting involved in a support group, in a 12-step community, getting involved in something that's out there, that's free, that's just people coming together around a common cause. And
Yeah.
again, the parallels for me to Ashtanga are great. Like I would say, 25% of your, yeah, I don't know if it's 25%, but I'd say 25 to 30% of people who practice Ashtanga abstain from substances. And I would say of that, half of them identify as in recovery.
Mm.
Now that's partially just due to the nature of the practice and the ethical observances and restraints that they promote. But I would say, like it is a replacement for some of those internalizing behaviors where, look, like we know if we take this substance, drink this, do that, like it's going to produce an effect, right?
Right.
And it's instant for the most part, like, and it's predictable, whereas engaging in a community is more up and down, and we need to your previous point, like we need to get used to surfing those waves that are going to come and go, but that we're probably going to be much better surfers when we're doing it in community.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Cool. That feels like a good stopping point, right?
I
I
think
like that.
so. So we found out we are skeptical of therapy in general. We are skeptical of it replacing community, but maybe agree on the fact that for anyone entering therapy, it may be a really important goal that they establish community outside of therapy.
Perfect. Yeah, I'd agree. I think that's exactly where we sort of landed.
Cool. Well, I'm gonna go cook some dinner. Not for my community tonight, but we'll be back at it soon.
All right. See you, man.
Later.
Later.